440 kilograms. That's the last confirmed figure the International Atomic Energy Agency had for Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, a level of enrichment that sits just below weapons grade, confirmed in a report that circulated in late February. From 440 kilograms is enough, if enriched further, for as many as 10 nuclear weapons. And here's the detail that should genuinely alarm you more than the raw number itself. The IAEA cannot currently account for where that stockpile actually is, or what physical condition it's actually in. It's believed to be sitting somewhere in the rubble of facilities that have now been bombed twice in under a year, unmonitored, unverified, and according to Iran's own recent declarations, completely off the table for negotiation. That declaration, that Iran's uranium stockpile is not up for discussion under any circumstances, is not empty rhetoric from a mid-level spokesperson. It came directly from Iran's negotiating team and its hardline leadership, framed explicitly as a matter of national sovereignty and regime survival rather than a technical or scientific question. And the American response to that declaration wasn't a diplomatic shrug. According to multiple independent reports, President Trump has been actively weighing an operation to send American special operations forces directly into Iranian territory to physically seize that uranium, a raid considered so serious that officials briefed the Wall Street Journal on the actual planning discussions happening inside the administration. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly why Iran drew this specific red line, what a raid to actually seize that uranium would require, and why it's considered one of the riskiest operations under discussion in this entire war, why Trump has separately proposed handing that same uranium over to Russia, and why, regardless of which option Washington eventually chooses, the fundamental problem here may not actually be solvable through military force alone. Stay with me for the full breakdown, because this is one of the most technically complex and strategically important threads in this entire conflict. Quick note on sourcing before we start. Everything in this video comes from a confidential IAEA report referenced in War on the Rocks. Reporting, direct statements from President Trump reported by Al Jazeera, Wall Street Journal reporting on the special operations raid planning, and analysis from the Arms Control Association regarding the broader proliferation risks involved. I'll be clear throughout about what's officially confirmed, what remains reported but unconfirmed planning discussion, and where genuine scientific and logistical uncertainty exists. Let's build this from the actual numbers. To understand why this specific uranium stockpile has become such a central flashpoint in this war, you need to go back to where it actually came from, because this material didn't appear as a result of this current conflict. It's the product of years of Iranian enrichment activity that accelerated dramatically after an earlier agreement collapsed. Following the breakdown of the original nuclear agreement known as the JCPOA years ago, Iran began advancing its enrichment program well beyond the limits that agreement had originally set, steadily building toward higher and higher purity levels over time. By the time this current war began, Iran had already accumulated a substantial stockpile enriched to 60% purity, a level that sits in a genuinely dangerous middle zone. Not yet weapons grade, which typically requires enrichment above 90%, but already representing the overwhelming majority of the technical work required to get there. Moving from 20% enrichment to 60% requires far more separative work than moving from 60% to 90%. Meaning Iran's existing stockpile already represents the hardest part of the journey toward weapons-grade material. It's worth understanding just how significant that specific technical detail actually is, because it's routinely misunderstood in casual coverage of nuclear proliferation issues. Enrichment work doesn't scale in a simple, linear way where each additional percentage point of purity requires roughly the same amount of effort as the one before it. The separative work required to raise natural uranium from its starting purity up to 20% represents the vast majority of the total effort needed to eventually reach weapons-grade material, because centrifuge cascades become progressively more efficient at concentrating the fissile isotope as purity increases. That means a country holding a stockpile already enriched to 60%, like Iran currently does, sits far closer to weapons-grade capability than the raw percentage difference between 60 and 90 might intuitively suggest. This is precisely why 60% enrichment has been treated as such a serious proliferation threshold by international monitors, and why Iran crossing and maintaining a stockpile at that level, even without formally weaponizing it, represents such a significant escalation from where its program stood before the original nuclear agreement collapsed. This is exactly why the stockpile itself, rather than just Iran's enrichment facilities and equipment, has become such a central focus of this entire war. You can bomb a centrifuge hall, you can destroy enrichment infrastructure, but 440 kilograms of already enriched material, once it exists, doesn't simply disappear when the building around it collapses. It remains physically present somewhere, in whatever condition the surrounding rubble left it in, representing a completed step in the enrichment process that can't be undone through an airstrike, the way undestroyed infrastructure can be degraded or destroyed. That's precisely the problem laid out clearly in analysis from the Arms Control Association covering this exact issue. Military force can set back Iran's nuclear program and destroy key infrastructure, exactly as the June 2025 strikes and this current war's strikes have both done. But military force cannot eliminate the underlying proliferation risk once enriched material and technical expertise already exist. At the end of whatever this conflict's current phase produces, Iran will almost certainly retain both the nuclear expertise built up over decades of program development and quite possibly the physical uranium stockpile itself, regardless of how many facilities get struck from the air. I want to pause here for a second because if breaking down not just the military dimension of this story, but the actual underlying nuclear science and proliferation logic, the reason a stockpile like this can't simply be bombed out of existence is the kind of depth you actually want from war coverage. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. I track every one of these developments with the same level of technical grounding, rather than treating a story this complex as just another headline about strikes and threats. Let's keep building this out, because the next part of the story is where Iran's actual declaration comes into focus. Let's talk about exactly what Iran said, and why the framing matters as much as the substance of the declaration itself. In late May, Iran's negotiating team made unmistakably clear, according to reporting on the diplomatic exchanges at that time, that its uranium enrichment program was fundamentally non-negotiable. This wasn't framed by Tehran as a technical or scientific position about the material itself. It was framed explicitly as a matter tied directly to regime survival and national prestige, a sacrosanct asset that no amount of external pressure, diplomatic or military, could compel Iran to relinquish. Analysts studying this specific declaration noted something important about the actual motivation behind it. The position was less about the physics of uranium itself and more about Iran's internal power calculus. Hardline factions within Iran's government could not allow the regime to appear weak domestically by surrendering what has become the single most potent symbol of Iranian technological achievement and sovereign independence, without risking a genuine fracturing of institutional authority at exactly the moment that authority is already under sustained external pressure. This connects directly to a pattern we've covered extensively in previous videos regarding how Iran approaches red lines throughout this entire war. Just as Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz an invincible red line and named its power plants as untouchable before the US treated both as priority targets anyway, the uranium stockpile now represents the same category of declared red line, except this one carries dramatically higher stakes than infrastructure or shipping lanes, because it involves the literal physical material at the center of the entire non-proliferation question this war has partly been fought over from the very beginning. Notably, this declaration came in the middle of active diplomatic efforts, not in their absence. Reporting from around this same period described last-minute diplomatic trips by Pakistan's interior minister, along with ongoing mediation attempts from Oman, exactly the same diplomatic channels we've covered in previous videos regarding the broader pattern of Iran negotiating and fighting simultaneously throughout this war. Despite those back-channel efforts continuing in parallel, Iran's position on the uranium specifically remained completely unmoved, suggesting this particular red line sits in a genuinely different category than the other points of leverage Iran has been willing to at least discuss adjusting through Omani or Pakistani mediation. Now, here's where the American response gets genuinely serious, and it's the part of this story that I think deserves far more attention than it's currently getting. According to Wall Street Journal reporting, citing U.S. officials familiar with the planning, President Trump has been considering a military operation to send American soldiers directly inside Iran specifically to extract nearly 1,000 pounds of Iranian uranium. Officials describe Trump as open to the idea of sending troops into Iranian territory for days, or potentially even longer, to complete the mission, while simultaneously weighing the very real risks to American personnel that an operation of this scale and complexity would involve. Let's actually walk through why this specific operation is considered so extraordinarily difficult and risky, because understanding the actual logistics involved explains why this remains a serious consideration rather than something already executed. Roughly half of Iran's enriched uranium is believed to be stored at Isfahan, a facility located more than 480 kilometers inland, hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest American naval assets. That distance alone represents an enormous logistical challenge for any special operations extraction. This isn't a coastal raid where forces can move in quickly from ships already positioned nearby and withdraw just as fast. It's a deep penetration operation into the interior of a hostile country actively at war with the United States, requiring forces to travel hundreds of kilometers past Iranian air defenses, military installations, and population centers, extract a physically hazardous material, and then travel that same distance back out, all while remaining undetected or capable of fighting through opposition if detected. Compare that distance to the kinds of special operations raids that have defined most of America's counterterrorism operations over the past several decades, and the scale of the challenge becomes clearer. Most high-profile American special operations raids, going back through recent military history, have typically involved insertion relatively close to a coastline or border, minimizing the time forces spent exposed deep inside hostile territory. An operation 480 kilometers inland against a country with a functioning air defense network, active military forces, and a population that would almost certainly report unusual activity to Iranian authorities, represents a fundamentally different category of risk than the shorter-range raids that have generally defined this type of American military operation in recent decades. The remaining half of Iran's stockpile, separately believed to be stored at Natanz, adds an additional layer of complexity, since any comprehensive extraction effort would potentially need to address multiple, separately located facilities rather than a single objective. And the material itself presents challenges that go well beyond simple distance and detection risk. Highly enriched uranium isn't something that can simply be scooped into a container and carried out. Military experts describing this operation to Al Jazeera specifically flagged chemical, logistical, and tactical hurdles as separate, distinct categories of difficulty, not simply variations on the same basic risk. The chemical handling requirements alone for safely packaging and transporting enriched uranium require specialized equipment and expertise that go well beyond standard special operations capability. That's exactly why reporting on this operation has referenced something called the Mobile Uranium Facility, a system specifically designed to package and remove highly enriched uranium from what's described as a less than secure state. But deploying that facility itself would require large-scale ground operation, including cargo planes and complex logistical support, essentially meaning the tool designed to make uranium extraction safer and more feasible is itself a massive undertaking that would require its own extensive protection and support infrastructure once inside hostile territory. Think about what that layered complexity actually means for anyone planning this operation. It's not simply a matter of sending in a small special operations team, grabbing a container, and flying out. It potentially requires deploying specialized handling equipment that itself needs cargo aircraft and extensive logistical support, all of which has to operate hundreds of kilometers inside a country, actively engaged in this war, for a mission that could last days or longer according to the reporting on Trump's own consideration of the timeline involved. Every additional day that operation runs increases the exposure of American personnel to detection, to Iranian counterattack, and to the genuine possibility of a mission failure that could result in American casualties, captured personnel, or a failed extraction that leaves both the operation's objective unmet and American credibility in this specific dimension of the war seriously damaged. Now let's turn to the second major option that's been reported as under serious consideration, because it represents a dramatically different approach to solving the same underlying problem, and it involves a genuinely unexpected third party. The United States has reportedly proposed that Iran transfer its stockpile of enriched uranium to a third country entirely, specifically naming Russia as the potential recipient, as part of a broader agreement aimed at scaling back Iran's nuclear program without requiring either a military seizure or Iran's own voluntary destruction of the material. When asked directly whether Russia would accept Iran's uranium reserves and whether Tehran had discussed this possibility with Moscow, the Kremlin's own spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, notably declined to rule it out, stating only that he would leave the question without comment. That non-denial is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about how seriously this specific proposal is actually being treated behind the scenes. A flat denial would have been the easy, low-cost response if Russia had no interest whatsoever in playing this role. Declining to comment instead, particularly on a question this specific and this consequential, suggests the possibility is at minimum being genuinely discussed at some level within the Kremlin, even if no formal agreement has been reached or announced. Think through why Russia specifically might be a plausible recipient for this material, because it's not an arbitrary or random choice. Russia already possesses the kind of specialized nuclear handling infrastructure and technical expertise required to safely receive, store, and potentially downblend highly enriched material into a form that no longer poses a proliferation risk. Russia also maintains an existing, complicated relationship with Iran that includes elements of both cooperation and its own separate strategic interests, meaning Moscow could plausibly present accepting this material as a genuine diplomatic contribution to reducing global proliferation risk, while also gaining significant leverage and goodwill with both Washington and Tehran simultaneously by playing the role of trusted intermediary in resolving one of the most dangerous open questions in this entire war. There's also a precedent worth considering here because this wouldn't be the first time enriched uranium has changed hands between countries as part of a broader non-proliferation arrangement. Downblending highly enriched material into low-enriched fuel suitable for civilian reactor use under international supervision has been used before in other contexts as a way to neutralize a proliferation risk without requiring the country that originally produced the material to simply destroy an asset it invested enormous resources into creating. If a version of that model were applied here, Iran could theoretically frame a transfer to Russia not as a surrender of an asset, but as a technical step toward eventually recovering some civilian nuclear fuel value from material that would otherwise remain a dangerous, unusable liability sitting in damaged facilities. Whether Iran's hardline leadership would accept that kind of framing, given how explicitly they've tied this stockpile to national sovereignty rather than any practical technical value, remains the central open question hanging over this entire proposal. However, reporting on this specific proposal notes that Tehran is expected to reject it, which brings us right back to the core problem underlying everything we've covered so far in this video. Iran has explicitly and repeatedly framed this uranium stockpile as a matter of sovereignty and regime survival, not as a technical problem with a technical solution. A transfer to Russia, however diplomatically elegant it might appear from Washington's perspective, still requires Iran to voluntarily give up physical possession and control of the exact material its own hardline leadership has declared completely non-negotiable. If the underlying Iranian position is genuinely rooted in domestic political survival, rather than any practical assessment of the material's actual military or economic value, no third-party transfer arrangement, however carefully structured, is likely to overcome that fundamental resistance. Let's connect this back to something we've covered extensively in a previous video, because it directly bears on how seriously Trump's threats around this uranium stockpile should actually be taken. In a televised interview that aired in mid-May, Trump warned explicitly that the United States would target any Iranian personnel attempting to reach the country's highly enriched uranium, stating directly that the material remains under constant surveillance by the U.S. military. That's a remarkably specific and operationally significant claim. It suggests American intelligence and surveillance assets have maintained persistent monitoring capability over the suspected location of this material, exactly the kind of continuous intelligence gathering capability we discussed in our previous video covering the precisely targeted American response following the attack on the 3 U.S. destroyers in the Strait. Notably, in that same interview, Trump appeared to somewhat downplay the immediate significance of the uranium remaining in Iran for the time being, a notable shift in tone from his broader public rhetoric throughout this war, insisting the United States absolutely cannot allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. That combination, maintaining active surveillance and issuing direct threats against anyone attempting to access the material, while simultaneously signaling some degree of tolerance for the material remaining in place in the near term, suggests Washington's actual operating strategy right now may be less about an immediate, urgent extraction and more about sustained containment. Preventing Iran from accessing or further processing the material through continuous surveillance and the credible threat of lethal force against anyone who tries, rather than committing immediately to the kind of high-risk special operations raid discussed earlier in this video. Let's talk about something that connects directly to how difficult locating and securing this material actually is, because it bears directly on both the raid option and the broader accountability problem. Analysis of the most recent American and Israeli strikes against Iran's nuclear infrastructure has noted something genuinely significant about how Iran responded operationally in the immediate aftermath. Within hours of those strikes, Iranian forces launched simultaneous retaliatory attacks across multiple fronts, without waiting for centralized authorization from senior leadership, suggesting Iran has established pre-delegated response authority across its military command structure specifically to guard against exactly the kind of decapitation strategy, eliminating top commanders to disrupt centralized decision-making that both this current war and the earlier June 2025 campaign have relied on. Israeli strikes during that earlier campaign killed the IRGC's commander-in-chief, the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, the Aerospace Force commander, and at least 14 nuclear scientists. And Iran's continued functional military response despite those losses suggests the regime has deliberately dispersed both its command authority and, quite possibly, control over sensitive assets, like the uranium stockpile itself, specifically to remain resilient against further leadership losses. That dispersal has direct implications for the uranium question specifically. If Iran has intentionally distributed authority and control over its nuclear program more broadly across its command structure, rather than concentrating it in a small number of identifiable, targetable individuals, that same logic likely extends to who actually knows the current location and condition of the enriched stockpile itself. A regime that has learned through repeated, painful experience that concentrated command and control creates vulnerability to decapitation Strikes has strong institutional incentive to ensure that knowledge of something as sensitive as its uranium stockpile's location isn't held by any single person or facility that could be eliminated or captured in a single strike or raid. That dispersal, while a rational defensive adaptation from Iran's perspective, makes exactly the kind of American extraction operation discussed earlier in this video considerably more difficult, since even a successful raid against one suspected location carries no guarantee that it actually captures the complete picture of where all of the material currently sits. Let's talk about the parallel military dimension running alongside all of this uranium-specific discussion, because Iran's broader declaration of what's off-limits hasn't been confined purely to its nuclear material. Around the same period this uranium stockpile debate was intensifying, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps separately declared that the country's broader military capabilities were, in their own words, entirely off-limits as well. That statement, layered directly on top of the uranium red line, tells you Iran's leadership has been constructing an increasingly comprehensive set of declared red lines throughout this specific stretch of the war, covering its nuclear material, its conventional military capability, and, as we've covered in previous videos, its critical infrastructure and the Strait of Hormuz itself. Layer all of these declared red lines together and a clear pattern emerges, one that should genuinely concern anyone trying to predict how this war continues to evolve. Iran isn't declaring a single narrow category off limits. It's systematically expanding the list of things it considers completely non-negotiable across nearly every dimension of this conflict: nuclear material, conventional military assets, critical infrastructure, and strategic waterways all included. And based on the pattern we've documented across this entire war, from the power plant threats to the Strait of Hormuz declaration to the Pickaxe Mountain facility continuing construction despite direct presidential threats, Washington's consistent response to Iran, naming something off limits, has been to treat that exact thing as a priority rather than avoiding it. Let's zoom out and talk about the broader strategic bind this creates for both sides, because it's genuinely more complicated than a simple story about American pressure eventually forcing Iranian compliance. Iran's insistence on treating this uranium stockpile as non-negotiable precisely because giving it up would represent an unacceptable domestic political cost means Washington's available options are genuinely limited to a narrow set of unappealing choices. A special operations raid carries enormous logistical risk and the real possibility of American casualties hundreds of kilometers inside hostile territory. A third-party transfer arrangement through Russia depends entirely on Iran voluntarily agreeing to something its own leadership has already publicly ruled out. Continued airstrikes against the facilities where the material is believed to be stored risk further scattering or damaging the material in ways that make it even harder to locate, account for, or eventually secure exactly the concern raised by the confidential IAEA report, noting the agency currently cannot verify the stockpile's location or condition following 2 separate rounds of strikes against these facilities. That last point deserves real emphasis because it represents perhaps the most genuinely alarming dimension of this entire story, one that gets lost when coverage focuses purely on the drama of potential raids or diplomatic maneuvering. Every additional strike against facilities suspected of housing this material makes the material itself progressively harder to account for, not easier. A stockpile, sitting in a monitored, functioning facility, however much Iran might restrict inspector access, is still at least a known, physically located quantity. A stockpile scattered somewhere within the rubble of repeatedly bombed facilities, with international inspectors unable to verify its location or condition, represents a genuinely worse outcome from a pure non-proliferation standpoint than the starting position, regardless of how much military damage those strikes have successfully inflicted on Iran's broader enrichment infrastructure and capability. This is exactly the paradox laid out in the Arms Control Association's analysis of this entire situation. Military strikes can degrade infrastructure and set back a program's technical progress, but they cannot eliminate the proliferation risk once material and expertise already exist. And in some ways, strikes that damage but don't fully destroy or recover, that material may actually make the long-term proliferation and accountability problem worse rather than better. A regime that survives this conflict retains its nuclear expertise and possesses an unaccounted-for stockpile of near-weapons-grade material scattered somewhere within damaged facilities represents a genuinely difficult long-term security problem, regardless of how militarily successful any individual strike or campaign within this broader war has been. Let's talk about what this means for the people and stakes beyond the immediate military and diplomatic maneuvering, because a scenario involving unaccounted for highly enriched uranium carries risks extending well beyond the current conflict's battlefield. Material that cannot be verified or monitored by international inspectors represents a proliferation risk, not just in the context of Iran's own government potentially completing a weapon, But in the considerably more alarming scenario of that material being lost, diverted, or falling into the hands of actors entirely outside Iran's formal government structure, amid the chaos and damage this war has already inflicted on the facilities where it was originally stored. That's precisely the kind of worst-case proliferation scenario non-proliferation experts have warned about specifically in the context of prolonged military conflict targeting nuclear facilities, and it's a risk that exists regardless of which side, if either ultimately wins the broader war. That risk becomes considerably more concrete once you connect it back to the pre-delegated authority and dispersed command structure discussed earlier. A nuclear program where knowledge and control has been deliberately spread across multiple individuals and factions, specifically to survive decapitation strikes, is also, almost by definition, a program with more potential points of failure when it comes to maintaining strict accountability over the actual physical material itself. Every additional person or faction with some degree of knowledge about the stockpile's location represents another potential point where that information, or potentially even the material itself, could be compromised, whether through capture, defection, corruption, or simple wartime chaos, disrupting whatever chain of custody Iran's government normally maintains over its most sensitive nuclear assets during peacetime conditions. So, where does this actually leave us right now, and what should you genuinely be watching for going forward? The Special Operations Raid option remains, according to the most recent reporting, a serious consideration rather than a confirmed operation, weighed carefully against the substantial risk to American personnel that a deep penetration mission of this complexity would involve. The Russia transfer proposal remains on the table diplomatically, even as Tehran is expected to reject it, given the uranium's role as a domestic political symbol of sovereignty rather than a purely technical asset. And underneath both of those options sits the genuinely uncomfortable reality that repeated strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, however militarily successful in degrading infrastructure, have made the actual stockpile of enriched material progressively harder to locate, verify, or account for, a problem that neither a successful raid nor a successful diplomatic transfer can fully undo once it's already happened. Before you go, two things I genuinely appreciate. First, if walking through the actual technical and logistical reality behind this specific standoff, why this material can't simply be bombed away, and why a raid to extract it is considered one of the riskiest operations under discussion in this entire war, gave you a clearer picture than the headline alone could. Share this with someone who's been trying to follow the nuclear dimension of this conflict without getting lost in the back and forth of individual news cycles. That's the only way analysis like this reaches people instead of getting buried under shorter, louder clips. Second, I want your take in the comments. Do you think a special operations raid to seize this uranium is actually worth the risk to American personnel? Or does the Russia transfer proposal, unlikely as Iran's acceptance may be, represent the more realistic long-term path to resolving this specific standoff? Drop your thoughts below. I read every one of them, and if this breakdown delivered real value, hit like so more people trying to understand this specific, genuinely complex thread of the war, get the chance to see it. Let's close with the full picture. Iran's stockpile of roughly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, confirmed in a confidential IAEA report from late February, represents material sufficient for as many as 10 nuclear weapons, if further enriched, and its current location and condition can no longer be verified following 2 separate rounds of strikes against the facilities where it was believed to be stored. Iran's own leadership has declared this stockpile completely non-negotiable, framing it explicitly as a matter of regime survival and national sovereignty, rather than a technical question open to compromise, a declaration that came even as diplomatic backchannels through Oman and Pakistan continued operating in parallel throughout this same period. In response, the United States has been weighing a high-risk special operations raid to physically extract the material from deep inside Iranian territory, an operation complicated by distance, by the specialized chemical handling the material requires, and by the extensive logistical support any extraction effort would need, alongside a separate diplomatic proposal to transfer the stockpile to Russia, an option the Kremlin has notably declined to rule out, even as Tehran is expected to reject it outright. President Trump has meanwhile confirmed the material remains under constant American surveillance, warning that any Iranian attempt to access it directly will be met with force, while separately suggesting some tolerance for the material remaining in place for now rather than demanding immediate extraction. Underneath all of these competing options sits the central uncomfortable truth this entire story keeps returning to. Military force can degrade Iran's nuclear infrastructure, but it cannot make already enriched material disappear, and every additional strike against the facilities housing that material risks making it progressively harder, not easier, to ever fully locate, verify, and secure. Whether this resolves through a raid, a diplomatic transfer, or an extended standoff neither side fully controls, This uranium stockpile may end up being the single hardest problem this entire war ultimately has to solve. Stay locked in, because the moment either the raid or the transfer moves from consideration into action, I'll be breaking down exactly what it means with the same level of depth.